My name is Carter. I've been a trucker for 15 years, hauling goods all across the country. You could say I've seen it all: long, empty highways, strange weather, and even stranger people. But nothing prepared me for the nightmare I stumbled into one cold November night. It started like any other job. Dispatch called me about a last-minute haul, a refrigerated load that needed to get from Texas to Colorado. The money was too good to pass up, but there was one catch. They wanted the delivery by morning, and the route they suggested took me through a desolate stretch of road called Route 54. "Are you sure about that route?" I asked, hesitating. My dispatcher, Lisa, chuckled. "Why? You scared of a little darkness? It's the fastest way, Carter. You'll be fine." I wasn't so sure. I'd heard stories about Route 54. Other truckers said weird things happened out there, lights in the sky, strange noises, and once a guy claimed he saw something chasing his rig. But stories are just stories, right? I loaded up the truck, double-checked my fuel, and hit the road by 7 p.m. The hum of the engine was comforting as I drove through the quiet Texas plains. I told myself it was just another job. I was wrong. By the time I reached Route 54, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The road was dark, and my headlights barely cut through the thick fog that seemed to roll in out of nowhere. I turned on the CB radio, hoping to hear another trucker's voice, but the line was dead, just static. About an hour into the drive, I saw him, a man standing on the side of the road. He was wearing a long coat and had his thumb out, like he wanted a ride. I slowed down. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't something I normally did, but this stretch of road was isolated. Leaving someone out here felt wrong. The man climbed into the cab, his face hidden by the shadows of his hood. "Thanks," he said in a low voice. "Not many people stop around here." "Where are you headed?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the windshield, his hands resting on his knees. "North," he finally said. "Just as far as you're going." Something about him made me uneasy, but I didn't press. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the tires on the pavement. Then he spoke again. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" I asked, glancing at him. "This road. It's not safe at night. They come when it's dark." "They?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He just stared ahead, his face pale and expressionless. The hitchhiker's words stuck with me. They come when it's dark. He wouldn't explain further, no matter how much I asked. After a while, I gave up, focusing on the road ahead. The fog grew thicker, and the air inside the cab turned cold, colder than it should have been. I adjusted the heater, but it didn't seem to help. That's when I saw it, a faint light in my side mirror. At first, I thought it was another vehicle, but the light didn't behave like headlights. It bobbed and weaved, almost like it was alive. It wasn't long before more lights appeared, floating in the fog like fireflies. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice tense. The hitchhiker nodded, his eyes fixed on the mirror. "They're here." "What are they?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled his hood tighter around his face, as if that would protect him. The lights moved closer, surrounding the truck. They flickered and pulsed, casting eerie shadows inside the cab. The engine sputtered, and I felt the truck shudder beneath me. "Keep driving," the hitchhiker said sharply. "I'm trying," I snapped, gripping the wheel. The lights were everywhere now, darting in and out of the fog. One of them slammed into the side of the truck with a loud thud, and I nearly lost. "What the hell is going on?" I shouted. "They're testing us," the hitchhiker said, "seeing if we're worth taking." The lights disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, but the damage was done. My truck started making a strange whining noise, and the dashboard lit up with warning signs. "We need to pull over," I said, scanning the roadside for a safe spot. "No," the hitchhiker yelled. "You can't stop, not here." "I don't have a choice," I said, as the engine gave out completely. The truck rolled to a stop on the shoulder, and the silence that followed was deafening. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cab, the hitchhiker trailing behind me. The fog was so thick I could barely see the hood of the truck. "Stay close," I told him. The hitchhiker didn't respond, but he stayed by my side as I opened the hood. Everything looked fine, which didn't make sense. The engine wasn't overheating, and there were no leaks. "They've marked us," the hitchhiker said, his voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" I asked, but before he could answer, I heard it. a low guttural growl coming from the fog. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Did you hear that?" The hitchhiker nodded, his face pale. "It's too late, they found us." The growling grew louder, and then I saw them, shadowy figures moving through the fog. Their eyes glowed like embers, and their bodies were twisted, almost wolf-like but far more grotesque. "We need to get back in the truck," I said, my voice shaking. The hitchhiker grabbed my arm. "The truck won't protect us. We have to run." "Run where?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "There's a place up ahead," he said, "a safe place. But we have to move now." I didn't have time to argue. The creatures were closing in, their growls turning into snarls. I slammed the hood shut and grabbed my flashlight, following the hitchhiker into the fog. We ran along the roadside, the creatures in pursuit. My heart was pounding, my legs burning, but I didn't dare slow down. Every time I glanced back, I saw their glowing eyes getting closer. "Over here!" the hitchhiker shouted, leading me toward a small building that loomed out of the fog. It looked like an old diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. We burst through the door and slammed it shut behind us. The creatures clawed at the windows, their snarls muffled by the glass. "They can't come inside," the hitchhiker said, collapsing into a booth. "How?" I asked, leaning against the door to catch my breath. "Because this place isn't really here," he said. "What do you mean it's not really here?" I asked, looking around. The diner was old, with cracked vinyl seats and a layer of dust on everything. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. "It's in between," the hitchhiker said, his voice distant. "A place they can't reach." I didn't understand what he meant, but I didn't care. For now, we were safe. Or so I thought. "My name's Danny Grayson. I've been a trucker for 20 years, hauling freight across highways most people only see in movies. My life isn't fancy, just me, my rig, and the open road." This story begins on a rainy November night. I'd just finished a haul in Atlanta and was on my way back to Kansas City when dispatch called me. "Danny, we've got a last-minute job for you," my dispatcher Joe said. "A load needs to go up to Montrose, Colorado. Pays triple." Triple was tempting, especially since work had been slow. "What's the catch?" I asked. "The route," Joe said. "You'll have to take Route 9. It's the fastest way." I hesitated. Route 9 wasn't a place truckers like to talk about. It was an old highway cutting through miles of wilderness. And it had a reputation, stories about trucks disappearing, strange lights in the sky, and people hearing voices that weren't there. But money talks. "Send me the details," I said, convincing myself it was just another road. By 9 p.m., I was loaded up and ready to go. The rain had turned to a light drizzle as I pulled onto the highway, my GPS directing me toward Route 9. The first stretch of the drive was uneventful, just me, the hum of the engine, and the occasional crackle of my CB radio. The rain stopped around midnight, leaving the air damp and heavy. I stopped at a truck stop to grab coffee and fuel. The place was nearly empty, except for a guy sitting at the counter with a worn-out hat and a long beard. He watched me as I paid for my coffee, his eyes dark and serious. "You headed up Route 9? He asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I said, surprised. "How'd you know?" "Don't go," he said, shaking his head. "That road ain't right." I forced a chuckle. "I'll be fine. Been driving these roads a long time." He didn't smile. "Doesn't matter how long you've been driving. Some roads don't play by the rule." I left without another word, his warning echoing in my mind. Route 9 was exactly as I remembered, narrow, dark, and surrounded by dense woods. The trees seemed to close in on the road, their branches casting long, spindly shadows under my headlights. The first hour was smooth. I kept my radio on, scanning for chatter from other truckers, but the line was dead. It was just me and the occasional sound of the forest. Then, the fog rolled in. It came out of nowhere, thick and white, swallowing the road ahead. I slowed down, my headlights barely cutting through the haze. The GPS flickered, struggling to keep up. "Great," I muttered. That's when I saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road. At first I thought it was just a hitchhiker. People still do that out here, though it's rare. But as I got closer, I realized something was off. The figure was tall and thin, almost unnaturally so. They wore a long coat that hung loosely, and their head was tilted at an odd angle, as if they were listening for something. I slowed the truck, the fog making it hard to see clearly. My headlights illuminated the figure for only a second, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. Their face wasn't right, too pale, with sunken eyes that didn't reflect the light. I hit the gas, heart pounding, leaving them behind in the fog. But then, the CB radio crackled to life. Shouldn't have stopped. The voice was faint, barely audible over the static. "What the hell?" I muttered, grabbing the mic. "Who's out there?" Silence. Then, a low whisper. "They're watching." I turned the radio off, my hands gripping the wheel tighter. The fog was getting worse, and the road seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't match my memory of it. Every so often, I thought I saw shapes moving in the fog. Shadows darting between the trees, just beyond the reach of my headlights. I told myself it was just my imagination, but then my engine sputtered. No, 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 I muttered, watching the gauges. The truck was slowing down, even though I hadn't taken my foot off the pedal. The headlights flickered, and the engine let out a groan before dying completely. I coasted to a stop on the side of the road, my heart racing. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the cab. The air was colder than it should have been, and the fog pressed against me like a living thing. As I opened the hood, I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the trees. I froze, shining my flashlight toward the sound. The beam caught a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. Then, another pair, and another. I slammed the hood shut and ran back to the cab, locking the doors behind me. The glowing eyes were getting closer, and now I could see the creatures they belonged to. They were wolf-like, but bigger, with long limbs and matted fur. Their mouths were full of sharp teeth, and their growls sent shivers down my spine. One of them leapt at the truck, its claws scraping against the metal. I fumbled with the keys, trying to start the engine. Come on, I shouted. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, the truck lurching forward. The creatures chased me, their glowing eyes reflecting in my mirrors. I didn't stop until I was sure they were gone. A few miles down the road, I saw lights in the distance, a small diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. I pulled into the gravel lot, my hands shaking as I climbed out of the cab. The diner looked abandoned, but the door was unlocked. Inside, the place was eerily quiet. The air was stale, and the tables were covered in a thin layer of dust. "Hello?" I called out. No response. I was about to leave when I saw something on the counter, a note, scrawled in messy handwriting. "They come at night. Don't stop. Don't look back." As I read the note, the diner lights flickered, and I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. "Hello?" I called again, my voice trembling. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the empty diner. I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Then, the hitchhiker appeared. It was the same figure I'd seen earlier on the road, but now they were inside, standing at the far end of the diner. Their sunken eyes stared at me, unblinking. "You shouldn't have stopped," they said, their voice a low hiss. "What do you want?" I demanded. "To warn you," they said. "You can't leave." I bolted out of the diner, my mind racing. I didn't care what that thing was or what it wanted. I just wanted to get out of there. Back in the truck, I fired up the engine and hit the road again. But something was wrong. The GPS wasn't working, and no matter how far I drove, the scenery didn't change. The same stretch of trees, the same fog, the same eerie silence. It felt like I was driving in circles, trapped on Route 9 with no way out. After what felt like hours, I saw something ahead, a massive wall of fog, thicker than anything I'd seen before. I didn't have a choice. I drove straight into it. On the other side was a clearing, with a single figure standing in the center. It was the hitchhiker. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, stepping out of the truck. "You took this road," they said. "Now it's part of it." Before I could respond, the creatures emerged from the fog, their snarls filling the air. I fought back, using everything I had, tools, flares, anything I could find. But it wasn't enough. The last thing I remember was their glowing eyes, closing in on me. After what felt like hours, I saw something ahead, a massive wall of fog, thicker than anything I'd seen before. I didn't have a choice. I drove straight into it. On the other side was a clearing, with a single figure standing in the center. It was the hitchhiker. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, stepping out of the truck. "You took this road," they said. Now it's part of you." Before I could respond, the creatures emerged from the fog, their snarls filling the air. I fought back, using everything I had, tools, flares, anything I could find. But it wasn't enough. The last thing I remember was their glowing eyes, closing in on me. "My name is Jack Coleman. For 15 years I've been a trucker, hauling freight across the country. Life on the road isn't for everyone. It's lonely, dangerous, and exhausting. But it's also all I've ever known." This story starts on a cold January night. I'd just delivered a load to Chicago and was parked at a truck stop outside the city, ready to head home to St. Louis. My CB radio crackled to life. "Jack, you there?" It was my dispatcher, Karen. "Yeah," rubbing my tired eyes. "I've got an urgent haul for you," she said. "A refrigerated load that needs to get to Denver by morning. The client's paying double." Double, even though I was dead tired. "What's the catch?" I asked. "It's a straight shot. Take Highway 377 for part of the route," Karen said. I hesitated. Highway 377 had a bad reputation among truckers. Rumors of strange accidents, eerie lights, and people disappearing without a trace. "You sure there's no other way?" I asked. "Not if you want to," Karen said. "It's your call, Jack." The money was too good to say no. "Send me the details." By 9 p.m., I was back on the road, hauling a trailer full of frozen meat. The highway was quiet, and the rhythm of the tires on the asphalt kept me focused. Uneventful. I passed through small towns and long stretches of empty road, listening to the radio to keep myself awake. Around midnight, I reached the turnoff for Highway 377. The road was narrower than I remembered, lined with dense trees on both sides. There were no streetlights, and the only illumination came from my head. As I drove deeper into the highway, a thick fog rolled in, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. "Just keep going," I muttered to myself. But something. About an hour into Highway 377, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road. They were wearing a hooded jacket, their arm outstretched in a classic hitchhiker's pose. Unsure of what to do. Picking up strangers wasn't something I usually did, but the fog and the cold made me feel bad for leaving them behind. I pulled over, rolling down the window slightly. "Need a ride?" The figure nodded, a cab without a word. They kept their hood up, their face hidden in the shadows. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "North," they said, their voice low and flat. "Works for me," I said, glancing at them. Something about them made me uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The hitchhiker and the silence in the cab grew heavy. We'd been driving for about 20 minutes when I heard it, a strange noise coming from the back of the truck. It sounded like scratching, faint but persistent. "You hear that?" I asked, glancing at the hitchhiker. They didn't respond, just stared straight ahead. I pulled over and grabbed my flashlight, stepping out into the fog. The air was freezing, and the silence was eerie. I walked around to the back of the trailer and opened the door. The cargo was untouched, neatly stacked and secured, but the scratching noise continued, coming from somewhere deeper inside. I climbed into the trailer, shining my flashlight around. That's when I saw it. A long, thin scratch running down the side of one of the boxes. "What the hell?" I muttered. Suddenly, the trailer door slammed shut behind me. I turned and banged on the door. "Hey, open up." No response. The beam growing weaker. The air inside the trailer felt colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The growl grew louder, echoing through the trailer. I backed up, my heart racing. And I stumbled out, falling onto the pavement. The hitchhiker was standing there, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. "What the hell's going on?" I demanded. "They're coming," said, their voice calm but chilling. "Who's coming?" Climbing back into the cab. I climbed back into the cab, shaken. The hitchhiker sat motionless in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. "You want to explain there?" I asked, my voice trembling with frustration. "They don't like intruders," they said, their tone flat. "Who are?" The hitchhiker didn't answer. They just pointed to the road ahead. The fog had grown even thicker, and strange shadows danced at the edge of my headlights. I couldn't tell if they were animals, branches swaying in the wind, or something else entirely. Gripping the wheel tightly. "If you know what's going on, you better tell me right now." The hitchhiker turned to me, and for the first time, I saw their face. Their eyes were dark, sunken, and filled with an unsettling emptiness. "You can't leave," they said. "Not until it's..." I shouted. The CB radio crackled to life. "Help, Mimdot, please." The voice was faint, barely audible over the static. I grabbed the mic. "What's going on?" The stat and the voice came through again, clearer this time. "They're here." I looked at the hitchhiker, but they didn't react. Their gaze remained fixed on the road ahead. "Who's here, Mike?" My voice tinged with panic. The radio went. Suddenly, something large and dark darted across the road. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the wet pavement. The hitchhiker didn't answer. They simply pointed ahead again. In the distance, faint lights flickering through the fog. As I drove closer, the lights became clearer. It was a gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly. The place looked old and run down, but the light suggested someone might be there. "I need answers," I said, pulling into the lot. The hitchhiker stayed in the cab as I stepped out. The air was unnervingly still, and the fog seemed to press against me like a living thing. Inside the station, the shelves were covered in dust, and the air smelled of mildew. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows. "Hello?" I called. No response. Then, counter, a journal, its cover worn and stained. I opened it. Flipping through the pages, the entries were frantic, scrawled in messy handwriting. "They come at night. They watch from the trees. Don't stop. Don't look back." The last entry was smeared with what looked like blood. They already know you're here." I heard a noise behind me, a low, guttural growl. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing. The growling grew louder, and the shadows seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. I bolted out of the station and back to the truck, slamming the door behind me. "We need to go. Now," I said, my voice. The hitchhiker didn't argue. I started the engine, and we pulled back onto the highway. I saw them, figures emerging from the fog. They were tall and gaunt, their limbs impossibly long, their eyes glowing faintly. They didn't move like motions were jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. "They're not real," I muttered to myself, gripping the wheel. "They're not real." "They're as real as you and me," the hitchhiker said. The highway seemed to stretch on forever, the fog growing thicker with each passing mile. My GPS was useless, and the odometer hadn't moved since we entered Highway 377. I said, my voice filled with frustration and fear. "This road doesn't end, does it?" The hitchhiker finally spoke. "It ends, but not in the way you think." "What does that mean?" I demanded. "You'll see." As if on cue, the truck's engine sputtered and died, leaving us stranded in the middle of the highway. "No, no, no," I muttered, trying to restart it. The engine groaned but wouldn't turn over. The figures in the fog were getting closer now, their glowing eyes fixed on us. "We can't stay," I said, grabbing my flashlight and opening the door. The hitchhiker followed me as I headed toward the trees, hoping to find a path or some kind of The woods were eerily quiet, the only sound coming from our footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. The fog seemed to thicken around us, muffling everything. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Forward," the hitchhiker said. Their calmness unnerved me, but I didn't have a better plan. Suddenly, the growling returned, louder this time. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The figures were there, standing just at the edge of the trees, watching us. "They won't let us leave," the hitchhiker said. "Then?" I asked. The hitchhiker turned to me, their face eerily calm. "We face them." The full story will build toward an intense final confrontation with these otherworldly entities, exploring the hitchhiker's true identity, the highway's cursed history, and Jack's fight for survival. Would you like this expanded further, with more action, suspense, or emotional depth as it unfolds? Trucking was my life. For 20 years, I'd driven every kind of rig, hauled every kind of load, and seen most of the lower 48. I was used to long nights and lonely roads, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered that night. My name's Hank Miller, and if you're reading this, let me warn you, don't ever take the back roads out of Ashwood County. It was a Friday evening, and I was parked at a truck stop near Kansas City, grabbing a quick dinner before heading back home to Amarillo. The place was the usual, a mix of truckers, travelers, and locals looking for cheap coffee. I'd just finished my burger when my phone buzzed on the... "Hey, Hank, it's Rick," came the familiar voice of my dispatch. "What's up?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "I've got a last-minute haul. Big money, but you'd have to leave tonight," Rick said. I sighed. My plan had been to get some rest, maybe call my daughter before bed. But Rick knew how to reel me in. "What's the load?" "Medical supplies. It's a rush job. Needs to be in El Paso by morning." "How much?" Rick chuckled. "Double your usual rate. They're desperate." "Double?" That got my attention. "What's the catch?" "Well," Rick hesitated, "you'll need to take Route 217 through Ashwood. It's faster, but, some drivers don't like IIT. I frowned. Route 217 wasn't on my usual paths, but I'd heard stories, odd accidents, strange sightings. Still, the money was too good to pass up. "I'll take it," I said. By 9 p.m., I was on the road, my trailer loaded with boxes of neatly packed medical supplies. The first leg of the journey was easy, a straight shot down the highway under a clear night sky. As I drove, I flipped through the radio stations. Most of them were static, but I finally found one playing classic rock. I cranked up the volume, tapping my fingers on the steering wheel. A couple of hours later, I reached the turnoff for Route 217. The sign was rusted and barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. The road was narrow, with dense trees on either side. There were no streetlights, and the darkness seemed thicker here, like the trees were swallowing the night. "Just a shortcut," I muttered to myself. "Nothing to..." But as I drove deeper into the woods, an uneasy feeling settled over me. About 30 minutes in, the fog rolled in, thick and heavy, clinging to the road like a living thing. My headlights barely cut through it, and I had to slow down to a crawl. The trees loomed closer now, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the shadows, but it was probably just my imagination. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, like something rotting, but it grew stronger the further I went. I rolled up my windows, but the stench seemed to seep into the cab anyway. "What the hell died out here?" I muttered. That's when I saw it, a deer lying in the middle of the road, its body mangled beyond recognition. I hit the brakes, my tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out to get a closer look. The deer's eyes were wide open, its mouth twisted in a silent scream. But what caught my attention was the claw marks, long, deep gashes running down its side. "Wolves?" I wondered aloud, though the marks didn't look like anything a wolf could make. A rustling sound came from the trees. I whipped my flashlight toward the noise, but saw nothing. The fog seemed to thicken, and the shadows grew darker. I didn't wait around to find out what was out there. Climbing back into the cab, I locked the doors and hit the gas. Another hour passed, and the fog showed no sign of lifting. My GPS had stopped working, the screen frozen on a blank map. I switched to my CB radio, hoping to hear another trucker, but the static was deafening. Then I saw a man standing on the side of the road, his thumb out in the universal hitchhiker gesture. He was wearing a tattered coat, his face obscured by the hood. I slowed down, my instincts telling me to drive on, but my conscience nagging at me. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, leaving someone stranded felt... I rolled down the window slightly. "Need a ride?" The man nodded but didn't say a word. He climbed into the cab, bringing a chill with... "Where you headed?" I asked. "Anywhere but here," he muttered, pulling his hood lower. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. "Name's Hank," I said, trying to ease the tension. "You got a name?" The hitchhiker didn't answer. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. Finally, the hitchhiker spoke. "You shouldn't have taken this road," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why's that?" I asked, glancing at him. "They don't like strangers," he said. "Who's they?" The hitchhiker didn't answer, just stared out the window. I was about to press him further when the CB radio crackled again. "Help me." The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the static. "What the hell?" I grabbed the mic. "Who's out there?" Static. Then the voice returned, clearer this time. "They're..." The CB radio went silent, but the chill it left behind lingered in the cab. I glanced at the hitchhiker. His hands were clenched tightly in his lap, his body tense. "Who's out there?" I asked. "Is this some kind of prank?" The hitchhiker didn't look at me. "You need to keep driving. Don't stop, no matter what you say." His words made my stomach knot. "What do you mean? Who's coming?" "They," he said, his voice barely audible. Before I could ask more, the radio crackled again. "Turn back, before it's too late." The voice was distorted, almost inhuman. Then, through the static, I heard something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on a hard surface. It grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to echo inside the cab. "Do you hear that?" I asked, gripping the wheel tight. The hitchhiker nodded. "They know we're here." I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and the shadows outside. The fog had become so thick that I could barely see 10 feet ahead. Then, I saw them, figures emerging from the mist. At first, I thought they were trees or rocks, but as I got closer, I realized they were people, or something that looked like people. They stood motionless on the side of the road, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the headlights like a predator. "What the hell are those?" I whispered. The hitchhiker didn't answer, but his breathing had quickened. I gripped the wheel and pressed the gas, refusing to slow down. The figures didn't move as I passed, but I could feel their eyes on me, their gaze piercing through the fog and into the cab. I thought I was in the clear, but then one of them stepped into the road. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. I swerved to avoid it, my tires skidding on the slick pavement. The truck veered dangerously close to the edge of the road, but I managed to regain control. "What the hell was that?" I shouted. "They don't want us here," the hitchhiker said. I glanced at him. "You seem to know a lot about this. Why don't you start..." The hitchhiker hesitated, then finally spoke. "This road, it's not like others. They're the things in the fog," he said. "They don't like trespassers. They'll do whatever it takes to keep you." A few miles later, I saw lights up ahead. It was a small gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly in the mist. I pulled into the lot, the truck's engine rumbling as I parked. "I thought you said not to stop," I said, turning to the "We need supplies," he said. And I wasn't sure what he meant by answers, but I wasn't about to argue. I climbed out of the cab, flashlight in hand, and headed for the station. The place was old and run down, its windows smeared with grime. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of mildew. Shelves lined with dusty cans and faded boxes filled the room, but there was no sign of a "Hello?" I called out. No response. A journal lying on the counter, its cover stained and worn. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. The handwriting was messy, frantic. "The fog is alive. Don't stop. Don't look. If you see them, it's already too..." The final entry sent a shiver down my spine. "They feed on fear. If you're reading this, you're..." I set the journal down, my hands trembling. That's when I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the back of the store. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice shaking. Frantic, like claws raking against wood. I backed toward the door, my flashlight flickering. Suddenly, the hitchhiker appeared behind me. "We need to go," he said. Together, we rushed back to the truck. As soon as we climbed in, the scratching followed. It was coming from the trailer now, loud and insistent. "What's in there?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "Drive," the hitchhiker said. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, the scratching growing fainter as we sped down the road. The clock on the dashboard read 3 a.m., but it felt like time had stopped. The road stretched on endlessly, the fog growing thicker with every mile. I checked the odometer. It hadn't moved since we entered Route 217. I said. It's the road, the hitchhiker said. It traps you, makes you think you're going somewhere, but you're not. I didn't want to believe him, but the evidence was piling up. What do we do? I asked. Keep going, he said. It's the only way out. I kept driving, but the road seemed endless, as if it were looping back on itself. No matter how far I went, the surroundings stayed the same gnarled trees, the same oppressive. I needed answers. Listen, I said, gripping the wheel tighter. You know more about this place than you're letting on. What's really going on? The hitchhiker hesitated, his face pale in the dim light of the dashboard. You wouldn't believe me if I Try me. He sighed and pulled back his hood, revealing a face weathered by time and hardship. His eyes held a haunted look, as if he'd seen things no man should ever see. This road isn't like others, he said. It's cursed, or haunted. I don't know the right word for it, but people who take it don't always come. That's not exactly reassuring, I said. The things in the fog, he continued, ignoring my comment. They're not human. They look like us, but they're wrong. They feed on fear, on desperation. The more scared you get, the stronger they. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why didn't you warn me about this before I picked you? I didn't think you'd believe me, he said. And besides, once you're on the road, there's no way off. Not unless they let you go. The scratching from the trailer started again, faint at first, but growing louder. It sounded like something or someone was clawing at the walls from the inside. What's in there? I asked, my voice tight with fear. You don't want to know, the hitchhiker. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop. No more cryptic answers. What's in the truck? The hitchhiker didn't respond. He just stared at me, his expression a mix of fear and resignation. Grabbing my flashlight, I climbed out of the cab and walked toward the back of the truck. The scratching grew louder as I approached, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing. Don't open it, the hitchhiker called from the cab. I ignored him. I had to know. My hands trembled as I unlocked the trailer doors and swung them open. The beam of my flashlight illuminated row after row of medical supply boxes, just as I'd expected. But then I saw it, a dark figure crouched in the corner, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It moved faster than I could react, lunging toward me with an inhuman screech. I stumbled backward, falling onto the pavement as the creature emerged from the trailer. It was humanoid but grotesquely distorted, its limbs too long, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bone. The hitchhiker jumped out of the cab, grabbing me by the arm and pulling me to my feet. Run, he shouted. We sprinted back to the truck, the creature close behind. I could hear its claws scraping against the ground, its breath coming in ragged gasps. We barely made it into the cab before it reached us. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature slammed against the door, its face pressed against the window. Its eyes were empty, soulless, and its mouth twisted into a grin that didn't reach its eye. Drive, the hitchhiker shouted. I didn't need to be told twice. I started the engine and floored the gas, the truck lurching forward as the creature clung to the side. The creature clung to the side of the truck, its claws digging into the metal. I swerved back and forth, trying to shake it off, but it wouldn't budge. Faster, the hitchhiker yelled. I'm going as fast as I can, I shouted. The road was narrow and winding, the fog making it nearly impossible to see, but I couldn't slow down, not with that thing hanging on. Finally, I swerved hard to the right, slamming the creature into a tree. It let out a guttural scream and fell away, disappearing into the fog. I kept driving, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. Is it gone? I asked. For now, the hitchhiker said, but it's not the only one. Fog began to thin, revealing a small town up ahead. The buildings were old and dilapidated, their windows dark and empty. We shouldn't stop here, the hitchhiker said. I ignored him. The truck was running low on fuel, and I needed a break. Like a town square, I parked the truck and stepped out. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was the faint creak of a rusted swing set in a nearby park. "This place is wrong," the hitchhiker said, his voice trembling. "You think everything's wrong." But as I looked around, I began to understand what he meant. The town felt lifeless, like it was frozen in time. I approached a diner with a flickering neon sign that read, "Open 24 hours." The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing an interior covered in a thick layer of dust. There was food on the tables, cups half full of coffee, as if the people here had vanished in the middle of their meal. That's when I heard it, a faint whispering, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Get out," the hitchhiker said, his voice urgent. "We need to leave." The whispers grew louder, wrapping around me like a fog I couldn't see. It was as though the town itself was alive, breathing, watching. "We're not alone," I whispered. "No," the hitchhiker replied grimly. "We never." The lights in the diner flickered, and the air turned cold. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting and bending like they had minds of their own. I backed away, pulling the hitchhiker with me. "We're leaving," I said, my voice firm. As we stepped outside, the entire town seemed to shift. The buildings leaned inward, their windows glinting like eyes. The whispers turned into laughter, low, guttural, and mocking. I sprinted back to the truck, dragging the hitchhiker behind me. As soon as we climbed inside, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, but didn't start. "Come on," I yelled, turning the key again. The laughter outside grew louder, and figures began to emerge from the shadows. They were the same distorted beings from the fog, their glowing eyes locked onto the truck. "You have to hurry," the hitchhiker shouted. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I floored the gas. The truck lurched forward, plowing through the mist and the figures. They didn't scream or flinch as I hit them. They simply dissolved into the fog. The road stretched endlessly before us, and the fog seemed thicker than ever. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached, but I didn't dare. "We can't keep driving forever," I said. "There has to be a way." "There is," the hitchhiker said, "but it's not what you think." I glanced at him. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then said, "The road doesn't just trap you, it tests you. It wants to know how far you're willing to go to escape." "And how do you know that?" I asked. The hitchhiker's face darkened. "Because I've been here before, and His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What happens if we—" "You don't leave," he said simply. The fog began to clear, and I saw something up ahead, a fork in the road. One path was narrow and winding, leading into a dense forest. The other was straight and smooth, disappearing into the horizon. "This," the hitchhiker said. "What's it?" I asked, my voice "The test," he replied. "One road leads out, the other doesn't." "How do we know which is which?" "We don't," he said. "That's the—" I stared at the two roads, my mind racing. There was no way to tell which one was. "We take the straight road," I said finally. "It's the obvious choice." "That's what they want you to think," the hitchhiker said. "Sometimes the easiest path is the I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to choose quickly. The figures were appearing again, their eyes glowing in the distance. "We don't have time for this," I. "Then trust your gut," the hitchhiker said. I made my decision and turned onto the winding road. The truck groaned as it climbed the steep incline, the trees closing in around us like the figures didn't follow. "I think we chose right," I said, relief flooding my chest. But the hitchhiker didn't respond. When I glanced at him, his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong?" I asked. Before he could answer, the road began to change. The trees twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches reaching for the truck. The ground trembled, and a deafening roar filled the air. "We're not out yet," the hitchhiker. The road narrowed, and I had to fight to keep the truck steady. Shadows darted between the trees, and whispers filled the cab. "Don't listen to them," the hitchhiker. I nodded, focusing on the road. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but I kept my eyes forward. In eternity, the trees began to thin, and I saw sunlight breaking through the fog. My heart leapt in my chest. "We did it," I said. But the hitchhiker didn't share my relief. He stared straight ahead, his expression grim. What's wrong? This is where we part ways. You're free, he said, but I'm not yet. Before I could respond, he opened the door and stepped out. The fog swallowed him instantly, and the road behind me disappeared. I wanted to stop, to go after him, but the truck kept moving forward on its own. When I finally looked back, there was nothing but an empty road. I don't know how long I drove before I reached civilization. The odometer worked again, and the fog was gone, but the memories lingered. No one believed my story when I told them. They said I must have fallen asleep at the wheel, that it was all a dream. But I know the truth. Route 217 is real, and it's waiting for its next track. I quit trucking after that, sold my rig and took a desk job in the city. But sometimes late at night, I hear the hum of a CB radio or the faint sound of scratch. And I wonder if I really escaped, or if the road is still calling me back.